Imagine you're a small town deputy in Louisiana. It's May 1934, and you've just helped ambush the most notorious outlaws in America. Bonnie and Clyde, they're dead in their car. Over 100 bullet holes. Blood everywhere is chaos. And then your boss, he pulls you aside and says, we need to move the bodies, make this look better for the photographers. So you do it. You reposition them, you stage the scene, and for the next 34 years you don't tell a soul. That could just actually have happened, and tonight we're going to talk about why.
Welcome back to The Hidden Lens. The most famous crime scene photographs in American history might be completely staged. For 90 years, we've stared at those haunting images of Bonnie Parker slumped against Clyde Barrow in their bullet-riddled Ford, frozen in what looks like their final moment together. But what if those iconic death poses were carefully arranged by law enforcement? What if the real scene was so brutal, so undignified, that authorities felt compelled to reposition the bodies before photographers arrived? Here's what should trouble you. Why would Deputy Sheriff Ted Hinton wait 34 years to admit he moved Bonnie's body? Why do glass fragments scattered across the corpses tell a completely different story than the bullet trajectories? And why did a small-town Louisiana mortician go to his grave, insisting he was ordered to lie about what he witnessed that day in May 1934? The death car photos aren't just historical documents. They're evidence, and that evidence suggests one of the most carefully constructed deceptions in American crime history. Let me walk you through what we were taught happened. May 23, 1934, Bienville Parish, Louisiana. 6 lawmen successfully ambushed the notorious Bonnie and Clyde after a months-long manhunt. 130 rounds fired in 16 seconds. Both outlaws die instantly in their stolen Ford V8 sedan. The photographs taken hours later show exactly how they were found, according to official reports. Bonnie collapsed against Clyde's right shoulder. Clyde's head tilted back against the seat, their bodies riddled with bullets but positioned as if death had been almost gentle, almost romantic. These images became the definitive end to the Bonnie and Clyde saga, proof that crime doesn't pay, evidence of swift frontier justice delivered by professional lawmen. The photos circulated in newspapers nationwide within hours, cementing the narrative of 2 young criminals meeting their inevitable fate. For generations of Americans, these photographs represented historical fact. What you saw was what happened. But photographs can lie, especially when the people controlling the scene have reasons to construct a specific narrative. The ambush team consisted of 6 men with everything to lose if this operation went wrong. Frank Hamer led the group, the legendary former Texas Ranger, whose reputation for infallible law enforcement was on the line. Ted Hinton, the young deputy sheriff from Dallas County, had actually known Bonnie Parker before she turned outlaw. 4 other officers represented multiple law enforcement agencies whose credibility depended on ending the Bonnie and Clyde crime spree cleanly and professionally. The scene controllers included local Louisiana law enforcement trying to manage chaos as thousands of souvenir hunters descended on the ambush site. C.F. Boots Bailey, the Arcadia mortician tasked with handling the bodies, would later claim he received very specific instructions about how to prepare the corpses. Multiple newspaper photographers raced to capture what they knew would be the scoop of the decade. The stakes extended far beyond 2 dead outlaws. This was about Frank Hamer's reputation as a lawman who always got his target. The credibility of multiple law enforcement agencies that had been embarrassed by Bonnie and Clyde for over 2 years. A Depression-era nation hungry for closure to a crime spree that had made folk heroes out of cop killers. Everyone involved needed this to look perfect. What's your take on crime scene photography? Do you think law enforcement has a responsibility to document exactly what happened, or should they consider public sensitivities when releasing images? Drop a comment and let me know, because this question becomes crucial to understanding what happened next. Here's the official version that became historical record. 9:15 a.m., rural Louisiana highway near Gibsland. The posse waits in roadside bushes after receiving a tip about Bonnie and Clyde's location. Clyde is driving their stolen Ford, Bonnie reportedly eating a sandwich in the passenger seat. The ambush begins without warning. According to all 6 officers, the outlaws never had a chance to surrender, though whether surrender was ever an option remains disputed. The car rolls to a stop after absorbing over 100 rounds. Both occupants are clearly dead. Silence. Then chaos as locals emerge from nearby farms and businesses, followed by law enforcement securing the scene. Within hours, photographers arrive from Shreveport and other regional newspapers. They document everything methodically: the bullet holes in the car, the weapons found inside, the blood. But most importantly, they capture Bonnie and Clyde in death, positioned almost intimately in the front seat. These photographs become evidence, history, and legend simultaneously. They prove the efficiency of American law enforcement and the finality of criminal justice. The case is closed not just legally, but in the public imagination. Justice served. Two cop killers stop permanently. Frank Hamer becomes a national hero. The other officers receive commendations. The photographs serve their intended purpose perfectly. For 34 years, this story holds without contradiction from any of the 6 ambush participants. Then in 1968, Deputy Ted Hinton publishes his memoir titled Ambush. Buried in the pages appears a shocking admission that changes everything we thought we knew about those famous photographs. Hinton writes, and I'm quoting directly, "I rearranged them for a better picture. He moved Bonnie's body. He positioned her against Clyde for the photographers." But this raises immediate questions that Hinton doesn't fully address in his memoir. Why admit this 34 years after the fact? Why did none of his fellow officers ever mention this detail in their own accounts? What exactly did rearranging for a better picture involve? And most troubling, what did the scene actually look like before Hinton's intervention? The glass problem emerges in the 1980s when crime scene analysts begin examining the death car with more sophisticated techniques. Glass fragments are scattered on the bodies in patterns that don't match the bullet trajectories documented in official reports. If Bonnie and Clyde were shot through the car windows as claimed, physics suggests the glass should have fallen differently. The fragments appear to be on top of blood that should have flowed after the shooting stopped. This indicates the bodies were moved after the initial blood loss but before the glass settled. Someone disturbed the scene. In 1979, aging mortician Boots Bailey breaks decades of silence about his role in handling the bodies. Bailey insists he received specific instructions about how to prepare Bonnie and Clyde for transport and viewing. He claims law enforcement told him to position the bodies in particular ways, but he never specifies exactly what those instructions involved. Bodies positioned for what purpose? Why would law enforcement care about post-mortem arrangements if they were simply transporting corpses to the morgue? Bailey's statement suggests coordination between the ambush team and local officials to control how the bodies would be presented. What was really at stake here becomes clearer when you understand the media pressure surrounding this case. Frank Hamer's entire career depended on this ambush looking clean, professional, and completely justified. Any suggestion of evidence, tampering, or scene staging could destroy multiple reputations and careers. The American public needed heroes and villains in 1934, not questions about police procedures. The timing problems multiply under scrutiny. How did photographers manage to get such perfect, well-composed shots so quickly at a chaotic crime scene? Why do some contemporary witness accounts describe the bodies in different positions than what the famous photographs show? And why were certain early photographs taken at the scene never released to the public? Most significantly, why did 5 of the 6 ambush participants maintain absolute silence about any scene manipulation for decades? Ted Hinton was the youngest member of the team, the one who knew Bonnie personally from his Dallas County work. What was eating at him that finally compelled him to break that silence in 1968? The 1990s brought forensic blood spatter analysis to the death car examination. Modern techniques revealed what investigators in 1934 couldn't detect or chose to ignore. The blood patterns tell a dramatically different story than the official photograph suggests. Bonnie's blood shows she was initially positioned forward over the dashboard, not gracefully leaning against Clyde's shoulder. The spatter patterns indicate she died face down, likely with severe facial trauma that would have made her unrecognizable. Clyde's position appears more consistent with the photographs, but even his final pose shows signs of post-mortem adjustment. Enhanced analysis of multiple photographs taken that day reveals the truth about scene staging. Early crime scene photos, taken before media photographers arrived, show the bodies in markedly different positions. Later photos, the ones that became historically famous, show the repositioned bodies that created the iconic image of Bonnie and Clyde dying together. Someone absolutely staged the scene. The question was no longer whether it happened, but who ordered it and why. Ted Hinton's private papers, discovered by researchers decades later, contain the full confession that his published memoir only hinted at. The complete truth was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Hinton was explicitly ordered to reposition Bonnie's body because the actual death scene was too gruesome and undignified for public consumption. Bonnie had been shot multiple times in the face and was slumped forward in what Hinton described as an unglamorous position that didn't fit the story we needed to tell. The brutal reality of 130 bullet wounds and destroyed faces wouldn't serve law enforcement's narrative needs. They required photos that showed a clean end to the Bonnie and Clyde saga. The cover-up wasn't about hiding police misconduct or an unjustified shooting. This was about controlling public perception and historical narrative. Law enforcement wanted photographs that depicted 2 outlaws who died together, almost romantically, rather than the savage reality of what happens to human bodies when hit with that volume of gunfire. Frank Hamer and the other senior officers made a calculated decision that the American public needed a palatable version of violent justice. Ted Hinton, as a junior member of the team, was assigned to create that version. What we know now, based on 90 years of investigation, is that the most famous crime scene photographs in American history were indeed carefully staged, not to conceal a wrongful shooting or cover up criminal behavior by law enforcement, but to construct a more acceptable version of brutal justice for mass media consumption. Ted Hinton carried the psychological weight of that deception for 34 years, before finally admitting his role in creating false historical evidence. The staged photographs became the accepted truth that 3 generations of Americans believed without question. The real scene was apparently too graphic, too honest about what violence actually looks like, for the mythology being constructed around Bonnie and Clyde's death. The repositioned bodies created a narrative of romantic outlaws meeting their fate together, rather than 2 people destroyed by overwhelming firepower. Several questions remain disputed among investigators and historians. Did all 6 lawmen participate in the staging, or was it primarily Hinton's responsibility? Were there other crime scene manipulations beyond repositioning the bodies? How many other historical photographs from this era were similarly arranged for public consumption rather than documenting actual events? The truth 90 years later doesn't change what Bonnie and Clyde did during their crime spree, or the likelihood that they would have continued killing law enforcement officers. But it reveals how authorities were already manipulating crime scene evidence for media consumption in 1934, establishing practices that would become standard procedure for decades. It also demonstrates how easily false narratives become accepted history when they serve everyone's interests. Law enforcement got their heroic story. The media got compelling photographs. The public got closure. Only the historical record suffered. Speaking of staged crime scenes from the 1930s, you won't believe what investigators discovered about the Lindbergh baby kidnapping evidence. Documents declassified in 2012 reveal that the most famous kidnapping scene in American history was potentially contaminated and rearranged before FBI agents ever arrived. The implications for one of the most controversial executions in New Jersey history. Here's what keeps me awake thinking about this case. If law enforcement was already manipulating crime scene photographs in 1934, decades before modern media pressure and 24-hour news cycles, how many other iconic images from American crime history don't actually show us what happened? What other scenes were arranged to fit the story that authorities needed to tell rather than documenting the messy reality of violence and justice?